This week on the Nonprofit News Feed, my name is George Weiner. I'm the Chief Whaler of Whole Whale, and I have Nick Azulay, a digital strategist over at Whole Whale, where we work. Nick, how's it going?
It's going great, George. Trying to stay cool in this very hot week in New York City. Stay cool out there. Check on your neighbors. But for the
Hold
first
on. Before
story,
we jump into it, I do have the first
uh,
story, which is I will be going on paternity leave starting next week. So you won't see or hear from me, hopefully, for a little while, and Nick will be taking over. I will be figuring out how to manage a third child and into our pod over here and my family.
love that, George. George, our first story that we want to highlight is that Adobe, the company that makes popular tools like Photoshop and Illustrator, has come under fire due to its changes in its term of service. So the updated terms has sparked widespread concerns among users and creators who fear that their data might have been used to train Adobe's generative AI models without their explicit consent. So the alarm seems to stem from an update in the terms and service that seemed to grant the company broad access to user content. And this led to fears going viral on X, formerly Twitter, that Adobe might exploit this content to train its AI models and is kind of snooping through folks' content shared on cloud servers and potentially training its generative AI products on them. So in response, Adobe has clarified it did not train its generative AI models on customer content and does not take ownership of a customer's work. There were some copyright issues here, and committed to updating its terms of use by the end of June. And the company also clarified that it does not scan content locally stored on users' computers, but does in its cloud, seemingly mostly to comply with law related to illegal imagery, like abusive imagery, that kind of thing. So, George, we have yet another big tech company at the center of some debates about transparency and AI use. And George, I can't for the life of me understand why these companies just can't be transparent. They've seen this happen time and time again. Customers don't like it. Be transparent and upfront and say that they will not train on content customers don't want AI models trained on.
I think it's tough for companies whose job it is to increase value for the shareholder to sit on mountains of data and just sort of like let it sit there in the corner and not use what these new tools offer, right? Training your own LLM for additional features, even if, you're like, oh, we're anonymizing it. Oh, we're doing it this way. I think there's a real push to say like, oh my gosh, look how much more we could monetize here. We could create our own generative models that we could then further monetize. All we have to do is take all of the content from our users from a previous agreement where they didn't fully agree to it, but whatever, we'll just slip this in. We'll leave it nice and vague so that if we get sued in the future, we can point to our terms of service and say that. And so I think, when these companies are going through these arcs of, all right, let's put out some vague, hey, we may use this for general training and information that we put in here. Don't worry, it's like anonymized, your data is safe, but we're going to train an LLM on it in vague terms and leaving that door open. They're sort of testing the water to see what users will do and what they'll tolerate. And that's what it is. What are you willing to tolerate? What were the original agreements when you walked in the door? And do you feel that users will leave you if you change those agreements to then train these LLMs that you'll be able to monetize, create better features? Like undeniably, like we work with the same types of things with causewriter.ai. We have data submitted by our users and we delete those data. We're generating over 7-8 million words and interactions a month, and we wipe that stuff every quarter. Alternatively, we could take that. Well, we could take all of that if we just put it in their terms of service suddenly, say, we're going to train our own nonprofit focused model on everything you're putting in there. I don't think our users would be thrilled with that. But it's tempting, right? To say, oh, look at the monetization opportunity to do this. All we need to do is just make it a little vague over here in the fine print and then force people, which is what they were doing. There's a new little pop-up and people are like, well, wait a minute. It seems like you changed 4 key things in that old privacy policy. And I firmly believe that this isn't the last we will see of a large company trying to do this and get away with it. And for now, it's up to discerning users and folks taking to social media to really point point out and call foul on anything that even smells vague.
Yeah, George, I think that's a great point. And actually, as we go to air, I just got an alert that the Department of Justice has actually filed suit against Adobe for a legal subscription model that made it really hard for customers to cancel. And if anyone's used Adobe products, you know that the whole subscription pricing model is extremely opaque and hard to use. So it seems that the Department of Justice is now looking into this for consumer protection reasons. So not a great week for Adobe. All right. I'll take us into our next story. This one comes from Wired. And the story here is that OpenAI, the nonprofit and LLC wrapped into one organization, backed nonprofit, so nonprofits backed by OpenAI, have gone back on their transparency pledges. So Open Research and UBI Charitable have decided to stop disclosing their financial statements and internal policies despite previous pledges of transparency. So Open Research was initially funded with $10 million from Sam Altman in 2015 and accumulated about 27 million in contributions through 2020, but ended up in debt to Altman by the end of that year. UBI Charitable, for its side, launched with 10 million from OpenAI in 2020 and has received over 31 million by the end of 2022. These organizations are investing and studying the impacts, but are reneging on their commitments to transparency. What do you make of this, George?
I think research and work around universal basic income is incredibly important, and how it's done, the journey is the destination. I think transparency must be baked into that process. Otherwise, the results will not be trusted. You risk invalidating your findings if the journey getting there is sort of steeped in this, wait a minute, why aren't you disclosing what's going on? For example, is it just becoming more expensive to distribute, monitor, and manage this than we realize? You should disclose that. It's part of that process. We don't have full information, but that's because of the lack of and change in decision for transparency. So journey is very much the destination on this. It is important work, incredibly important work. And I think I deeply respect the fact that Sam Altman is investing in this to the level that he is to see how UBI actually works in the real world rather than just in a academic concept statement. Because if AI is going to be changing the landscape of work, we should be aware of how we need to restructure compensation and other deeper questions related to it.
Yeah, George, I think that's exactly true. And continuing along the AI and the societal impact line of thinking here, this one comes from Scientific American and is interesting and something that's really important and not something we probably talked about enough on this podcast, and that is the environmental impact of AI within our world. So AI seems like magic, but does require a ton of compute power. And it's reported that Google's new AI overview feature, which aims to streamline search results, we've talked about it before, and is rolling out to, quote, 1 billion users by the end of 2024, as it's slowly kind of being rolled out across the planet, comes with significant environmental and financial costs. So experts estimate that generating text with AI uses about 30 times more energy than traditional search methods and could lead to increased carbon emissions and higher operational costs. So, for instance, the LLM Bloom emits greenhouse gases equivalent to driving 49 miles per day, and analysts predict that AI could cost Google's $6 billion annually if widely adopted in, operational costs that also have downstream environmental impact. George, what do you think about the environmental impact of AI that requires tons of compute power? And do you think it at all relates to the concerns of some of similar concerns regarding cryptocurrency and some of the concerns about the environmental impacts and the heavy compute power required there?
I want to be careful about drawing parallels to the environmental arguments of cryptocurrency, which were sort of steeped in the unnecessarily wasteful architecture, I think, of some of those coins. And that can be debated. I hear it. But there is, arguments there. This is, I think, slightly different, but important to have as well. As you should be aware that as you're adopting these new technologies, as we all adopted Zoom, for instance, like I used to do phone calls back in the day, Nick, there was a thing called a phone, and I'd spend a lot of time on that phone talking with somebody on these pitch calls. Now, guess what? The amount of compute power, the amount of storage necessary when I have a video based call and then have it recorded and then I have it stored, like all of that is so much more, data intensive, bandwidth intensive. And so I think acknowledging that, one of the things in this stat here, which was interesting, yes, that 30 times more energy costly is interesting, but also in here, they show that generating 2 AI images uses as much energy as a smartphone charge. I don't know, but it really struck me differently. I was like, oh, I should really be thoughtful when I'm generating these types of things. And I think part of that is, be responsible. Don't just sort of play with these things on an ongoing basis in a wasteful way. Be intentional in the same that you wouldn't just do, drive around your block 50 times for fun. You're like, I want to use these and I want to use these in a conscious way because there's a real cost behind it. I don't think that cost should mean you don't use it. I think it is too powerful a tool. I also believe and have seen that, they talk about one particular model. It depends on the model you use for how efficient or inefficient it is. And like all things, the first versions of our tech are often its most inefficient. So right now we are using the most inefficient models we will ever use. And over time, guess what? The market will drive down the costs of energy because that reduces their COGS. And right now, I think the other stat that they showed is that data centers, including those used for AI, represent about 1.5% of global energy usage. And they're projecting that doubles by 2026. That's not a surprise to me at all, given how pervasive the integration of AI is going to be into all of our tools, and hopefully will produce other efficiencies. But it's not without cost. And I have been watching and been trying to get a straight answer out of somebody who's like, how much energy is a token using? And the answer is it depends. So it's interesting to see these benchmarks and ultimately, like, will we have a green option? I'm sure where it's going to be, hey, here's the offset. So I think the offset market here is ripe. Offset market is ripe for someone to come in and say, hey, here's how we measure it. And by the way, you can use the green option and offset your AI API usage costs.
Yeah, George, I have a follow-up question to that. It's speaking about some of the downstream impact, which I think are really important, especially as we're growing in scale. We talk about the need for compute power in AI, but you've seen companies like NVIDIA, their stock taking off, right? Developing all the chips, the processing power. That still requires physical infrastructure, right? Do you think that we are getting to the point where this physical infrastructure, a lot of which requires precious metals, we're going to start to be in some kind of a conundrum in which we're in a scarcity of resources? Of course, precious metals have human rights implications. Are you at all worried that we're going to that we're kind of up against the physical limitations of the earth and our ability to ethically mine these metals? Is that an inhibitor to the growth of this technology that requires tons of compute?
Well, I think we passed ethical mining a while back, and we've occasionally had stories about that rare earth metal extraction from nature, and then also from the communities that house it, and how that value is rarely captured by indigenous populations. I'll say this sort of ends justify the means of like the importance of the work, overshadows the damage done to the local ecosystem has traditionally been in play. I'm not smart enough to tell you whether or not we have like maxed out on rare earth metals yet, but I think, each time we think we've hit a wall of these resources, somehow we find a more innovative way to extract more out of the area. We should pay attention to, for sure, the stories coming out of local areas that supply the precious metals necessary, and certainly the human rights elements there. But yeah, demand for these types of chips and the things that involve there with the lithium, silicon, nickel, and other metals are like very much in demand. And if you're looking for like more technical interest of it, you could look at commodities markets and prices on that. And the higher the price goes, the more danger maybe the like sort of like, oh, well, let's rip aside that extra mountain once that price and cost on the actual commodity increases for that type of rare earth metal that they're using for a bill.
Mm, got it. All right, George, how about a feel-good story?
Yeah, what do you got?
I have one that this one comes from Ars Technica, and that is Proton, the makers of Proton Mail, are actually turning to a nonprofit foundation model. So the security-minded email and productivity suite is becoming a nonprofit foundation, and there are no shareholders, only one mission. Perhaps this isn't a feel good, it's just a continuation of our other stories in that similar vein. But I think really cool to see anything in tech not using nonprofits as a means to becoming some, billion-dollar company, but actually a company thinking just like Patagonia before it, hey, we're switching to a sustainable kind of like mission-driven burst model, which is really cool to see.
And also the their tech is very much known for their privacy and willingness to keep your data as your data. And I think that's going to matter a lot more. And frankly, trusted as a nonprofit. We talked about the shareholder pressure to increase shareholder value. The nonprofit doesn't deal with that type of pressure. They're not being tempted to say, hey, Proton Mail users, like, let's just rip all your data by changing our terms of service because we have to make more money for the shareholder. That motivation is gone. Show me the incentive, I'll show you the behavior. So I trust nonprofit tech disproportionately to for-profit in terms of doing the right thing with our data for the right reason. Nick, I have a question for you.
I'm ready.
Why did the STEM nonprofit robot get angry?
Why did the STEM nonprofit robot get angry?
Because kids were pushing its buttons.
That's good, George.
You kids.
Kids these days.
All right, Nick. Good luck. Hold it down for me.
I got it. Good luck to you, George. I'll see you on the flip side.